Oh, yeah, please.
Okay.
Okay. So let me repeat. Gail is the Emerita Professor of Philosophy at the Sage School at Cornell and an Emerita Senior Fellow of Merton College in Oxford, also a visiting scholar at Stanford University. But, and she is one of the main leaders in the field of ancient epistemology and other issues in general. But I'd like to mention one thing. I remember meeting her. She was a final year graduate student and was visiting Princeton to decide whether she would go there or not. I was about to leave for Pittsburgh, and she didn't come. She went to Harvard instead. Not a bad decision in the long run. But I want to say one thing that impressed me incredibly. I was reading the Petty Ideas years and years ago, and she said something almost casually, but it sort of changed my view of things. She said that all of us who were working on the relationship between Plato and Aristotle made the assumption that either Plato was right or that Aristotle was right. And she pointed out that the issues are really difficult and that it's not always clear who gets it right and who doesn't, and that we should keep that in mind as we're trying to see how those two great philosophers dealt with one another. So that made a tremendous difference for me, because I was thinking either one is right or the other one is right. And she said, well, they may both be right and they may both be wrong. It's philosophy. Don't prejudge the issues. And I learned a tremendous historical and hermeneutical lesson from that. So I'm particularly glad to welcome her here. I hope I can get to hear her. And I'm sure the rest of you who will have a very good time about it. So please go ahead and don't mind me if I come in and out. Thank you. Welcome, Gail. And I'm sorry I'm not there to say hello personally.
Thank you very much for troubling in the circumstances to come at all. And thank you all for the invitation to talk about some aspect of Plato's metaphysics and epistemology in Republic 5-7. I'm going to focus on Plato's views about truth in part of Republic 6. It's an overly ambitious title to the paper because I'm going to start at the beginning, but only go through 502c6, where there's a clear break in the argument. I have two main reasons for wanting to explore this passage. First is where it's located in the Republic. It's nestled between two famous arguments at the end of Republic 5 and the equally or even more famous images of the sunline and cave. Yet this intervening passage has not received as much attention as have Republic 5 arguments and the sunline and cave, though Dimitri recently talked about some aspects of it, though focusing on different issues from what I'll focus on. So I wanted to redress the balance as a prelude. It will only be a prelude to seeing what, if anything, it might contribute to our understanding of the Republic 5 arguments and the sunline and cave, whether it might cause some of us to rethink the way we thought about them or not. And a second reason I had for wanting to focus on this issue is that the main thing I'm working on in Plato in general is Plato on truth at the moment. But until this invitation, I hadn't considered this passage at all. I was focusing on the Phaedo and the Philebus for the most part. Yet the passage uses truth terminology quite often. And I wanted to see how it does so and how it fits with other passages that likewise use truth terminology. In particular, in two forthcoming papers, one on the Phaedo, one on the Philebus, I argue that what I'll call semantic truth, what some people call representational truth, others call propositional truth, plays a much more important role than it has generally been thought to play in Plato's metaphysics and epistemology. And I wanted to see whether the same is true in this part of Book 6. Before turning directly to Republic 6's use of alethic terms, that is, his use of truth, alêtheia, and its cognates, I want to begin by making some general remarks about Plato's use of them, a topic about which there is considerable controversy. So I want to go over some of the general issues that have been raised, general ways in which Plato's been thought to use alethic terms, and then see how that plays out in Republic 6. So one issue of disagreement is whether he thinks alêtheia is univocal, that is, whether he thinks it has a single sense. There's also dispute about how many kinds of truth he recognizes. Roughly, the Bank of the Charwell and Barclays Bank are banks in different senses of the term bank, but oranges and apples are different kinds of fruit in the same sense of the term fruit. Another issue, at least among those who think that Plato either recognizes and or that we should recognize different senses of truth and or different kinds of truth, is whether Plato thinks that one sense or kind is in some way prior to another or to all others, and if so, how? Different commentators have taken different lines on that. There's also dispute about whether Plato confuses or conflates different senses of truth or different kinds of truth. Another kind of difficulty is that different commentators often use the same terminology in different ways, and they also sometimes use different terminology from one another, and it's not always clear how, if at all, these all map onto one another. There's also dispute, of course, about what sense of truth or kind of truth is at issue where. Well, I obviously can't discuss all these issues here, but in the rest of this part of the paper, I'll just describe some ways in which Plato's been thought to use alethic terms both in general and in Republic 6 in particular, the part that I focus on. Then in subsequent sections, I'll ask whether, and if so, where in Republic 6 he does so, and in some related passages, and if he doesn't do so, what the alternative is. It's often thought that Plato distinguishes, and or that there are, in fact, whatever his view might be, at least two senses or kinds of truth. What I'll call semantic truth, it's on the handout, and ontological truth. These have been explained in different ways. For our purposes, it will do to say that semantic truth is the sort of truth involved in saying, for example, what you say is true. And ontological truth is the sort of truth involved in saying, for example, as Plato several times does, that someone is a true philosopher, meaning that she is in fact, really, genuinely a philosopher rather than a sham or pretend philosopher. These two senses or kinds of truth aren't exclusive. A given sentence, for example, can be both semantically and ontologically true. It might be a genuine sentence, so ontologically true, that correctly says how things are, and so semantically true. A sentence can also be both ontologically true and semantically false if it's a genuine sentence that doesn't correctly say how things are. Plato mentions the second sort of case in Republic Book 2 at 382, in speaking of a true falsehood or lie, something that is in fact really semantically false. In Love's Labor's Lost, not by Plato, but by Shakespeare, someone talks about something being a false plagiarism, meaning it's wrongly thought that he plagiarized himself. I'll stick to Plato, though. Okay, Plato recognizes that speaking of a true falsehood is an odd way to speak. After using the phrase, he says, if I can call it that. So that suggests he thinks there's an important difference between semantic and ontological truth. That he thinks this is also suggested by Phaedrus 247c 5-6, where he says one must be bold enough to say what is true, to alethes, especially when speaking about truth, alêtheia. What is true is semantic truth in this particular sentence, whereas truth in this particular sentence refers to forms. It doesn't mean forms, but that's the reference of alêtheia in that context, and is a kind of ontological truth. Although Plato sees that there's an important difference between semantic and ontological truth, it's difficult, perhaps impossible, to know whether he thinks there's different senses or different kinds of truth, or perhaps he didn't consider that issue beyond noting that they're different in some way. It doesn't matter for my purposes which of those options is correct, but it will be helpful for the sake of clarity to write as though the two types of truth are different senses of truth. So I'll generally speak that way without meaning that Plato's thought it all through and that's his considered view. Even if ontological and semantic truth are not are not exclusive, because a given thing might be true in both senses, they are sometimes thought to be exhaustive of the senses of truth. And for the most part, but not always, I'll assume that view here. Doing so leaves room for there to be different kinds of both ontological and semantic truth. Again, in saying that they're exhaustive or that I'll treat them that way here, I don't mean to suggest that that's Plato's considered view. Again, he might not have considered the issue and taken a stand. But even if he didn't explicitly consider the issue and take a stand, he might write as one would, who thinks that ST and OT, semantic and ontological truth, are or are not exhaustive of senses of truth or of kinds of truth. Again, it won't matter for my purposes whether he thinks they're exhaustive, though it will sometimes be convenient to speak as though they are. Okay, so now I'm going to turn to some particular ways in which Plato has been thought to use alethic terms. And in doing so, I'll largely, but not entirely, focus on Jan Zeif's account, because his is the most systematic and detailed one I know of. And I'll discuss some of his views in what follows, but I'll also mention some other commentators from time to time. And some of these types of truth that I'm going to look at are in section 1 of the handout. First, Zeif distinguishes what he calls confirmative emphasis from what he calls paradigmatic emphasis. An example of confirmative emphasis is when we say that someone is truly a philosopher or a true philosopher, where we mean that she's in fact a philosopher, not a sham. That's the sort of example I gave a little while ago. An example of paradigmatic emphasis is when we say with special emphasis that someone is a true friend, meaning that they're an especially good friend. I'm not exactly sure how Zeif understands the difference, but in my understanding of it, an especially good friend is a kind of true or genuine friend in the same sense of true. So it's one kind of confirmative is the way I would look at it. I'm not sure if that's Zeif's way of looking at it. Zeif also mentions what he calls truth in the soul. He thinks truth is used that way when we might have expected Plato to mention episteme or sophia or some other high-level cognitive condition instead. That is, he thinks Plato uses alêtheia, the abstract noun, without using sophia or episteme when that's in fact the referent of alêtheia in that particular case. He says that the most telling evidence that Plato uses alêtheia that way is Republic 490 A to B, which falls within the part of Republic 6 I'll be considering shortly, and I'll look at that passage in some detail then. Thirdly, Zeif discusses what he calls epistemic truth, which he explains as follows. So it's on the handout. By epistemic truth, that is Zeif, means truth as that which can come to be known in the acquisition of knowledge. He distinguishes two kinds of epistemic truth, or two senses of epistemic truth. Sometimes he uses one way of speaking, sometimes the other. One is when we say that knowledge or true belief is true, which I take to be semantic truth. But, Zeif says, sometimes epistemic truth is identified with an aspect or element of reality. In such cases, he says, truth does not refer to a quality of statements or mental states, but to true reality, which can only be revealed through reasoning and is opposed to deceitful appearances. This is an epistemic notion of truth because of the conceptual link between truth and knowledge, but it's also an ontological notion since it identifies the truth with knowable reality. And he calls that the ontological epistemic notion of truth. Since he thinks that for Plato, only forms are knowable, he thinks that only they are OET, as I'll call ontological epistemic truth. And so he thinks that Plato sometimes uses truth in such a way that only forms are true. Zeif thinks OET is used in various passages, one of which is 486c7, which I'm going to discuss in detail shortly. Does Plato in fact use alethic terms in all these ways? According to Blake Hester, to mention another commentator, in his book, Plato on the Metaphysical Foundations of Meaning and Truth, quote, surely Plato thinks there is only one sort of truth, and it lies in the direction he is pointing while he stands with Aristotle at the center of Raphael's school of Athens. On this view, Plato thinks truth is used just for forms, and so for a kind or sense of ontological truth. Well, I think the view that Plato uses truth just for forms is plainly false. And indeed, Hester elsewhere says that Plato most often uses alêtheia for semantic truth. However, he and Xanthippe, among others, think that the use of alethic terms for forms is especially important in the middle dialogues. Xanthippe, for example, says that the subsequent argument after the Republic V argument and through VII, and the similes used there frequently involve the characterization of forms as that which is true in the realm of truth. Well, I won't make any claims here about what use of alethic terms is most prevalent overall in Plato, taking his corpus as a whole, or even in the Republic as a whole. I'm going to largely restrict myself to how he uses them in the part of Book 6 that I focus on, but also on some related passages. Does he use them for both semantic and ontological truth, both for confirmative and paradigmatic emphasis, for truth in the soul, what Xanthippe calls that, for OET, ontological epistemic truth? Are there signs, as some commentators think there are, that he's unaware of or confused about the difference among these different kinds or senses of alethic terms? Earlier, I mentioned two passages, one from Republic II and one from the Phaedrus, that suggest he's aware of and not confused about the difference, but perhaps his awareness and clarity is sporadic. Okay, with this background in mind, let's turn now to Republic VI. Republic VI opens with Socrates saying that they are now clear, after the discussion in Republic V, about who are philosophers and who are not. Philosophers, he says, are those who are able to grasp what is always the same. Non-philosophers are those who are not able to do so, and instead wander among the many things that vary in every sort of way. There's dispute about whether Republic V defines philosophers. We heard a paper from Alexander a while ago saying that at least Republic V doesn't do so. It's also a question about how exactly he defines philosophers, if he ever does so. There's also dispute about whether the things that he says are what always the same are forms or not. Again, Alexander, in a paper he read a while ago, doesn't think forms have been introduced yet. Other people think they have been, some other people. So it's agreed that the guardians in the city should be able to guard the laws and ways of life of the city. And Socrates proceeds to argue that only philosophers who actually grasp the things that always are able to do this, so they should be the guardians. In 484d, he makes it clear that grasping forms is not sufficient for being suitable for guarding the laws and ways of life of the city. He says they also need a certain amount and kind of experience, as well as various virtues in addition to wisdom. And a large part of Book 6 and 7 describes both the sort of experience that's needed and also the various virtues that are needed. I'll mostly focus on the epistemological claim, though. His first step in arguing that only the guardians, who are those who know the things that always are, is to say, this is section 2 on the handout. Then do they seem to you, the people who aren't like that, to be at all better than blind people, those who in reality are deprived of the knowledge of each thing that is, and have no clear paradigm in their soul, and are not capable, by focusing as painters do on what is truest, and referring back to it on every occasion, and studying it as exactly as possible. In this way, then, of laying down also the laws, nomima, here about fine, just, and good things when they need to be established, and to guard and preserve them once they have been established. I find this to be an extraordinarily puzzling passage. It's the first use of an alethic term in Republic VI in section C1, focusing as painters do on what's truest. In order to understand how truest is being used, we need to understand the passage it's a part of. To do that, we need to answer at least 4 questions, also on the handout. What is the clear paradigm? What does it mean to say that it's in the soul? What is it that is truest? Is it the paradigm or something else? And if the latter, what? And how is truest being used? Before answering these questions, it will be helpful to look at some other passages elsewhere in the Republic about paradigms and about what is in the soul. So I'm going to begin with some remarks about paradigms as they're discussed in the Republic. One relevant earlier passage, this is section 3 on the handout, is 409a to d, where Socrates describes what a good judge or juror should be like. I won't read the whole passage out, but I'll discuss it. Plato says, Socrates says, he shouldn't have had, the good judge or juror shouldn't have had any experience of bad people when he's young. For if he did, he would run the risk of himself becoming bad. He discusses that also at 401 to 2. That's why Socrates says, the better sort of young people appear simple-minded and easily duped by the unjust ones. They don't have paradigms in themselves. So paradigm in somebody for the way the bad are affected. A bad person, by contrast, Socrates says, has and is guided by a paradigm in his soul, which is or is based on his bad character. Although a good judge doesn't ever have a bad disposition in his soul, he needs to know what injustice is, and of course also what justice is. He acquires this knowledge not through experience, which is how the bad person acquires his paradigm, but by having a fine natural endowment and also through education, as Socrates says at 409d to e. This will eventually enable the good judge or juror to know what injustice is and also what justice is. I take it that this knowledge consists in his having an account of what injustice is and of what justice is. And I want to suggest that these accounts function as paradigms in his soul that he can use to decide whether a given person or action or a given law or mode of behavior is just or unjust. This interpretation of 409 is supported by 472, which is section 4 on the handout. First, Socrates says that they were trying to discover what sort of thing justice is and what sort of thing injustice is. He infers, ara, that they were looking for a paradigm of justice so that they could tell whether someone is completely, teleos, just. The paradigm of justice tells what justice is. It's an account of the nature of justice. Focusing on this account enables the judge to determine, among other things, who is just. Similarly, for a paradigm of injustice. Plato also suggests, Socrates also suggests that they were looking for a paradigm of a perfectly just person. This will not be an actual just person, since all humans fall short of what justice is, though they can participate in it. But, Plato says, someone might paint a paradigm of what the finest human being is, whether or not there is or could be such a person. I take it this will be an account of what such a person would be like. Plato also mentions having a paradigm both of a just person and of justice. This makes sense for an account of what a just person is, that he talks about one of justice, not just of a just person, would be too narrow for his purposes. He's interested not only in just people, but in just laws, just actions that requires knowing more than what it is to be a just person. He also says, various places they were making a paradigm in words and logo of a good city. Again, the paradigm is an account of what a good city would be. If we put these passages together, it seems reasonable to suppose that to know what justice is to have in one's soul an account of what it is, which can serve as a clear paradigm of justice. One can then use this paradigm to ascertain whether a given person or city or action is just. In the case of justice, the paradigm in the soul is of a form, since justice is a form, though they haven't been introduced at this point in the Republic yet. But the paradigm in the soul is not itself a form. In the case of the city, the paradigm is also an account, but it is not even of a form, since Plato doesn't posit a form of the ideal city, nor does the ideal city exist anywhere in Plato's view. Nor, Plato says, does a completely just person exist, nor does he think one can exist. So one can have a paradigm of something in one's soul, even if that thing doesn't and indeed couldn't exist. It will do to have a paradigm in words, in particular when knowledge is at issue, an account, saying what something is. The paradigms at issue are clear, as in 484. Not all paradigms are, but the ones at issue in 484 are, because they embody knowledge and are suitable for their purpose. The bad person, by contrast, in section 3, he has an inadequate paradigm, one that is or is based on false beliefs, and so relying on it leads him astray. Okay, later I'm going to consider 2 further passages on paradigms. But first, since 484c mentions having a clear paradigm in the soul, I want to look at some passages where Plato says that something is or can be in the soul. I won't read these out. They're on section 5 of the handout, or some of them are. Plato talks about various things being in the soul, both in the Republic and in other passages. Among the things that can be in the soul are logoi, but those are only one of the kinds of things that he says are in the soul. Okay, so as you can see from that list, the things that are said to be in the soul fall into 2 broad categories. One category consists of character traits, such as being unjust or fine, kalos, and cognitive conditions. He mentions doxa, episteme, phronesis as all being in the soul. The other category consists of the contents of various cognitive conditions. For example, logoi, which are either semantically true or semantically false. When they're semantically true, truth is in the soul. When they're semantically false, falsity is in the soul. And if you look at those passages, you'll see some where Plato says that truth is in the soul. All of these cases of being in the soul are cases of what I will call ontological immanence, which corresponds roughly to Descartes' notion of formal reality. According to Descartes, the sun is formally in the sky. That's where it is located. Descartes contrasts this with what he calls objective reality. The sun is objectively in the soul when we have an idea of the sun, but it is not formally in the soul, though the idea of it is. None of the passages I cite in section 5 uses in the soul for Descartes' objective reality, or for what we might call epistemological immanence. Nor could I find a passage in Plato that does so, unless he does so in 484c, a question I turn to now. Okay, so with that background, let's return to 484c. If we're guided by the passages that I've looked at on paradigms and being in the soul so far, it's natural to think that the clear paradigm in the soul is a logos in the soul, in particular, an account of what a form is that a person has in his soul, a person with knowledge. So it's not an abstract account that's in his soul, but his particular knowledge, something more like a sentence token. Plato has just mentioned someone who lacks knowledge of forms. He then tells us that such people have no clear paradigm in their soul. By contrast, if one knows what a form is, one has an account of it in one's soul, and this account can function as a clear paradigm, clear because it embodies knowledge. And calling it a paradigm is to emphasize that the account is not merely of epistemological theoretical importance. The philosopher ruler consults it in establishing laws, for example. So that's how I want to interpret that passage. However, two passages I haven't yet considered might be thought to count against that interpretation. And these are on the handout also, section 6 and 7. I'm not going to read them out loud, but I've italicized the most important parts and I'll summarize them. The first passage that might seem to count against me is 500b to 501c, section 6 on your handout. Socrates is explaining why philosophers should rule. He acknowledges that the majority would not accept this view, but he argues that's because they don't understand what it is to be a genuine philosopher. Once they understand this, they will agree with him that philosophers should rule. And then we get section 6, which is meant to show that. I'll return to it in a minute. But first, the second passage that might seem to count against me is section 7 in your handout, 540 in the Republic. It's been thought to say that forms are paradigms, or more exactly, that the form of the good is. Okay, the interpretation of the first passage, the 500 to 501 passage, is disputed. According to Berniet, for example, quote, "In it there is hardly any metaphysics, just vague talk with a suitably devout reference to Homer at 501b of the philosopher as a semi-divine figure, who like a painter will wipe clean the tablet of the city and its people, and then sketch a new social order with his eye on a divine paradigm." He contrasts that non-metaphysical interpretation of 500 with the more, as he puts it, the more philosophical version of the painter analogy given to Glaucon at 484c. Berniet doesn't say what the more philosophical version is, but I assume he means that it involves the view that the paradigm in 484c is a form, a view he does not think is mentioned in 500 to 501. Other people, Dominic Scott, for example, thinks the first half of that passage mentions forms, but he agrees with Berniet about the second half, that it's just vague metaphor. Other people think the whole passage, both the first and second half, describe forms as divine paradigms. And I actually agree with that view. For the paradigms are said to be what philosophers look at, study, and indicate. They are always the same. They look, Plato says at 501b 2 to 3, at what is naturally just, fine, moderate, and everything of that sort. And I take those to be forms. Moreover, parts of the argument are reminiscent of the argument at the end of Republic 5, where Plato hopes to win over those who don't initially acknowledge forms by persuading them that knowledge isn't possible unless forms exist. I take Plato to be arguing that at the end of the argument. As to 540, so far as I know, everybody thinks, I haven't found any exception to the view, that it says that rulers who know what the form of the good is use it as a paradigm in putting its citizens and themselves in order, as he puts it. So I take 500 to 501 to describe some forms as paradigms, those indeed that the ruler needs to consult, which includes justice and so on. And 540 describes the form of the good as a paradigm, though it doesn't say it's divine. So there are two differences between those passages. 500 has more forms at issue in mind than 540 does. 540 talks about forms being divine, 500 doesn't. But despite those differences, they both say that ruler uses either forms or a form as paradigms in fashioning themselves in the city. If 500 to 501 takes at least some forms to be paradigms, and 540 says that the form of the good is, doesn't that suggest that the clear paradigm in the soul in 484c is a form, perhaps the form of the good in particular? I don't think, contrary to some commentators, that 484c is restricted to the form of the good. Coupled with 484b 4 to 5 and 484d1, he thinks at least the forms of fineness and justice, perhaps among others, are also relevant. But the main issue is whether the clear paradigm in the soul is a logos or a form. Those actually aren't the only two options. I've seen other things suggested, but I favor one and most people favor the other, so I'm just going to discuss those. Well, there is one important difference between 484c on the one hand and 500 to 501 and 540 in the other, one that might give us pause about taking the paradigms mentioned in 484 to be a form, which is that the paradigm in 484c, but not in the later passages, is said to be in the soul. I suggest that forms are paradigms that are not in the soul, whereas the paradigm in the soul at 484c is an account of what a form is. So the paradigms at issue in the earlier contexts and the later ones are different. Plato uses paradigms for many different kinds of things. It's not always the same usage or referent. Well, you might think that's improbable. After all, the paradigm in the soul, if it's not a form, and forms seem to be used in the same way to guide someone who has knowledge and molding people's characters and so on. Why would one need to look at two different sorts of paradigms? I think the answer is that Plato thinks that to know a form is to know an account of it. And if one knows that logos, account, it's in the soul as the content of one's knowledge. The logos is of the form, but is not itself a form. Plato thinks, this is a controversial claim, but one I believe, that one can have different cognitive access to forms, in emphasizing not every grasp involves having a logos of it, in emphasizing that the paradigm in the soul is the logos in the soul of someone with knowledge. He's explaining that the sort of person he has in mind does have knowledge and so a logos, not some lesser grasp. He's also adding that the ruler uses the logos as a paradigm to help him establish and maintain laws. It's not that the ruler focuses on the logos and ignores the form. Rather, to use the form as a paradigm just is to use the paradigm in his soul as one. Okay, before leaving 500 to 501, I want to look briefly at 501 D1 to 2, which also uses an alethic term. Here he says that philosophers are lovers of what is and of truth, using both an ontic term to ontos and an alethic term, alêtheias. Given the context, it's reasonable to think that to love what is to love forms. But what is it to love truth? One might think that to kai is epexegetic, and that truth is being used for what is, and so for forms. However, in my view, kai is conjunctive. I think Rowe thinks that too. At least he inserts a comma in his translation between the ontic and alethic term. The lover loves both what is, namely forms, and truth, in particular, the semantic truth about forms, especially the semantic truths that say what forms are. Plato is emphasizing that it's not just that philosophers love forms, it's also and especially that they love the truth about them. Plato thinks the philosophers who are qualified to be guardians have to have the best sort of knowledge. And so he goes on to discuss the form of the good and to say why without knowledge of it, knowledge of other things is useless. Later, we'll see other support for this reading. If that's his point, it may reinforce the suggestion that the clear paradigm of the soul is an account, a logos specifying the truth about what a form is. Okay, we've now discussed two of the four questions I raised earlier. We've said what the clear paradigm is and what it means to say that it's in the soul. But what is truest, and what does it mean to say that it is truest? Like many others, not everybody, but most others that I've consulted anyway, I think the paradigm is truest. If the paradigm is a form and is truest, the point would presumably be that forms are the truest things there are. That's Jan Zeif's interpretation. On this interpretation, truest would be some form of ontological truth. However, I cannot find any other passage in Plato that says that forms are truest using the superlative. The Phaedrus passage refers to them as true, but he doesn't use the superlative that way. So 484c would be a one-off if it said that. It would also be a one-off if it used in the soul for epistemological rather than ontological immanence. Of course, it might be a one-off in either or both of those ways, but it's worth asking whether there's another interpretation on which it is not a one-off. And on my interpretation, it isn't a one-off in either of those ways. If the paradigm in the soul is an account and is of what's truest, my interpretation, The point is that it specifies the most important truths about forms, since it tells us what they are. Truest is semantic truth, and in the soul is ontological immanence. And speaking in those two ways is not a one-off. Okay, I'm falling behind, so I won't cite other passages to support that view, but you can ask him about that later if you want to. Okay, so I'm now going to move on to another section that there's more to say about 484. I got rather obsessed with it, as you could perhaps tell. But I'll now turn to 485 to 9 on wisdom, truth, and philosophers. Okay, at 485, Plato says more about what philosophers are like. First, he repeats that they love the sort of learning that makes clear to them some feature of the being that always is. This suggests that the sort of learning that makes a feature of forms clear does so by enabling one to acquire a clear account of what they are. That this is what Plato means is suggested by what follows. For he proceeds to say that philosophers refuse to accept what is false. They love the truth, and so they aim to admit, pros dechesthai, what is false into their souls. They do their best to avoid believing what's false. They strive to accept what's true. They want the truth to be in their souls, in particular, the truth about what forms are. So that's semantic truth and falsity. Plato then says at 485c7 that someone who is erotically inclined loves everything akin to and belonging to sungenes tikai oikeon, the boy he loves. Similarly, since philosophers love wisdom, he loves truth. For Plato says, nothing belongs to wisdom more than truth does, oikeoteron. The context suggests that truth is still semantic truth. He's just been talking about loving truth, where that's semantic truth, and he is continuing that discussion. Nothing belongs to wisdom more than semantic truth does, because wisdom is truth entailing and includes the most important truths, which say what forms are. At 485d, 3-4, Socrates infers that someone who loves learning must especially strive for all truth from childhood on. It's not clear how many truths are at issue here or at various other passages in this part of the text. He said that some people with philosophical natures love the learning that makes clear to them some features of the being that always is. That's less than all truth. So some passages have more, some have less truth in mind, fewer truths in mind. But however many truths are at issue in this stretch of the text, it's semantic truth. At 485e, Socrates mentions one who is truly alethos, a philosopher, as opposed to being a counterfeit or sham one. That's confirmative ontological truth. And in fact, Plato explains what it is to be a true philosopher in terms of his loving truth, semantic truth. So the two are connected. One explains the other, at least in that case. At 486b3, Plato mentions aletheia, true philosophy, genuine philosophy, as opposed to what's often mistakenly thought to be philosophy. It's another example of confirmative ontological truth. At 486d, this is section 8 on the handout, truth is said to be akin to what is duly measured, which here is someone's thought, dianoia, clearly using dianoia much more broadly than in the divided line. When that person's dianoia has been trained so as to be easily led to the idea form of each thing that is. I think truth is still here semantic truth, but not all semantic truths are intended. The relevant ones are just the contents of the thoughts of someone whose dianoia is duly measured. I take it thought is duly measured in that it's in the right order, which enables one to be led to the form of each thing that is. One is led there by relying on the truths that are the contents of one's duly measured dianoia. Truths are also akin to what's duly measured in that they are orderly insofar as they can't conflict, since truths can't conflict, and indeed they harmonize with one another. They're also akin to what's duly measured in that they track the truth and so harmonize not just with one another, but also what is the case. There's a passage in Xanthippe where he says, we're used to thinking of a semantic truth as being what's at issue, but he says, it does not strike the modern reader as immediately plausible to think that truth is akin to due measure, for we think of truth as a property of propositions, not as a quality things can have on account of their correct internal proportions. So he takes it to be ontological truth that's akin to due measure, whereas I have tried to make it plausible, contrary to what Xanthippe thinks, that we can take it to be semantic truth. I'll just mention what I say in the next section, since again, I'm running out of time. On section 9 of the handout, Plato mentions various traits that someone with a philosophical nature, someone suitable to become a philosopher, though they're not yet a philosopher, must have. He mentions being a lover of and akin to truth as one of them. And I take myself already just to have explained Plato, just to have said how some people can be lovers of and akin to truth, where truth is semantic truth. So I take truth in the passage at 9 also to be semantic truth. That's disputable. You can ask me that in discussion if you want. Okay, just to summarize this stretch of the text, I conclude that in 485 to 9, Plato sometimes uses alethic terms for ontological truth. I've only mentioned a couple of the places where he does so, but they're all just for confirmatory emphasis, to emphasize that something is a genuine, not fake wisdom, or that someone is a genuine, not a sham philosopher. All the other occurrences in that stretch of text are for semantic truth. And although Plato uses alethic terms for both, I don't think any of the passages that we've looked at confuse them. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to section 10 on the handout. Just before that passage at 489E4 to 490A3, Socrates reminds Glaucon that they've said that if someone is to become fine and good, he must be guided by truth if he is to have a share of true philosophy. To be guided by truth, in my view, is to rely on relevant semantic truths, which is necessary for becoming a true, that is, a genuine philosopher. He then goes on in passage 10, mentions a lover of learning who is struggling towards what is, that is, towards forms. In doing so, he is guided by, relies on truth. Plainly, truth there is not used for what is, or therefore for forms. If one is struggling towards what is, one doesn't yet have it. One is looking for it. One is guided by, relies on semantic truths, which enable one to find what is. Once one finds what is, which in this context are forms, one has intercourse with it, Socrates says, and begets nous kai alêtheia. Plato has already said that the lover of learning who's struggling towards what is guided by truth. Now he says that the person who begets nous kai alêtheia only after having intercourse with forms. But if he's guided by truth on his way to forms, why does Plato say that the learner begets nous kai alêtheia only after intercourse with forms? If he's guided by truth before that, doesn't he already have truth? Well, I think the answer to that question is that the truths the learner is initially guided by are different from the truths his encounter with forms give birth to. His cognitive condition is also different. Before he encounters forms, he doesn't have nous, but only some lesser cognitive condition. But what does it mean to say that nous kai alêtheia is or are begotten? I mentioned early on that Xanthippe thinks this phrase is the most telling evidence for the view that truth is sometimes used for a high-level cognitive condition. His reason is that, as he notes, the truth at issue in that passage, nous kai alêtheia, can't be mere true belief. He infers that kai is epexegetic and that truth is used as a name for nous. However, it doesn't follow from the fact, with which I agree, that truth here does not indicate mere true belief. That doesn't imply that it's used for nous, a cognitive condition. A preferable alternative is that truth is used here for the semantic truths that are the content of nous. This view could be defended in two different ways. We could say that nous kai alêtheia is a hendiadys. Intercourse with forms begets nous of the truth. If one has nous that P, one doesn't have a mere true belief that P. So we don't have to say it's mere true belief that's at issue. Another possibility is that kai is conjunctive. One begets nous and supply therefore alêtheia, where the latter is again the content of the former. In neither case does Plato have all semantic truths in mind. He has in mind just the STs that one has nous of. In neither case do we have to say that truth indicates mere true beliefs. But on this reading, isn't Plato saying that STs come to be? And wouldn't that be problematic? I have two replies to that worry. First, on the hendiadys reading, we need not say that the semantic truths come to be. What comes to be is nous of those truths. But even if, as the conjunctive reading would have it, intercourse with forms begets semantic truths, that's not problematic. For some semantic truths do come to be, namely those that are something like sentence tokens, which come to be ontologically in one's soul when Plato grasps them, since they are the content of one's cognitive condition. In that section 5 on things in the soul that I rather passed over, Socrates mentions various cases where logoi are in the soul, for example. He says in the Philebus, for example, that the scribe comes and paints within somebody a particular logos, and then the person gets doxa. So it's just that logos is particular to that person at that time. So some logoi, as Plato uses the term, do come to be. That this is what Plato has in mind is suggested by the pregnancy metaphor, which I looked at briefly above and discussed further below. This allows us to see how one can be guided by truth to forms, yet have nous kai alêtheia only after one has intercourse with them. Okay. Do I have time to mention these other passages where Plato mentions psychic birth? Or am I running? Yes. Oh, okay. So Republic 490 is not the only place where Plato discusses psychic birth. He also does so in the Symposium Phaedrus and Theaetetus. And I want to look briefly at those passages, suggesting that they support my interpretation of 490, on which truth is used for semantic truth. In Symposium 209a1-4, Socrates says that given the right circumstances, one gives birth to phronesis. He also then goes on to say that one gives birth to fine logoi. So logoi are being conceived as the kinds of things one can give birth to. Those logoi would be semantically true. The Phaedrus suggests the same view. At 276a, 5-7, Socrates mentions what's written with episteme in the soul of the learner. He goes on to identify those with epistemi, using the plural, which Rowe, for example, translates as pieces of knowledge. Epistemi about fine, just, and good things. What's written in the soul are true logoi that are the contents of someone's epistemi, and these logoi are about just, fine, and good things. He then goes on to mention someone who uses the dialectical techne and takes a suitable soul, planting and sowing in it logoi with episteme. That is, he plants and sows logoi in the soul of someone in such a way that the person acquires episteme. In the midwifery passage in the Theaetetus, Socrates compares himself to a midwife who helps minds give birth, ascertaining whether what they give birth to is eidolon is the word he used, a phantom or imitation, and not something true. Socrates enables others to give birth to the beliefs that are in them and helps them ascertain whether those beliefs are true. Beliefs are in one, and they're either true or false. So all of those are passages where Plato, as in 490 of the Republic, discusses psychic birth, and one can give birth to and have in one's soul true, and in some cases false, logoi. That makes it reasonable to suggest that giving birth to nous kai alêtheia, the alêtheia there also is semantic truth that one gives birth to. And that view fits well with the view that the clear paradigm in the soul in 484c is an account of the form and is what's truest, consists of the most important truths about what forms are. A further point is worth making here. The symposium doesn't say how one becomes pregnant, whereas the Republic does so. Miles Bruniette makes that point without elaborating or saying how it does so. I take it Plato does so in the Republic by describing the education that initially makes one pregnant with various logoi, and that, if all goes well, eventually enables one to give birth to nous kai alêtheia. Okay, just a further brief remark and then a conclusion. So at 490c, 5-7, carrying on from this passage, Socrates says it's not until one begets nous kai alêtheia that one knows and truly lives. Truly is ontological truth. One doesn't really genuinely live until one begets nous kai alêtheia. The point seems to be that in order to truly live, one must fulfill one's potential, which requires having nous kai alêtheia, where truth is st. As in 490, Plato says that the sort of person he's been describing will hate falsehood and be guided by truth. As before, that kind of remark, truth and falsehood are semantic. So just before and after the beginning passage, the relevant truth is semantic truth, which makes it reasonable to think he does so in 490 as well. Okay, so now just a brief conclusion. The most important passage that follows from the ones I've been discussing in the part of Book 6 I focused on is 500 to 501, but we've already discussed that, so it's time to draw our conclusions. On the view I've defended, alethic terms in our passage are not used either as a name for forms or as a property for forms, nor are they used as the name for a high level or any other cognitive condition. Rather, in the passages we've explored here, both in Republic 6 and also in some other passages, Plato uses alethic terminology in just two ways. First, he uses it for confirmative ontological truth, what a true philosopher is, what true philosophy is. Maybe in really genuinely living, that's paradigmatic truth, I'm not sure, but it's a kind of ontological truth, which is at least a case of confirmative. Secondly, in addition to confirmative ontological truth, he uses it for semantic truth. In saying, for example, that the philosopher is guided by truth, he means that he relies on relevant semantic truths. In saying that the philosopher loves truth, he means he loves semantic truths, especially those that say what forms are. If this interpretation of these passages is correct, perhaps we should reconsider the not uncommon view that semantic truth is relatively unimportant in the metaphysics and epistemology of Republic 5-7. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gail, for this important contribution to the concept of truth in the central books of the Republic. Before we proceed to the question, I would like to ask Alexander Nehamas if he would like to make a comment before we proceed.
His video is he's muted.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah. So, Alexander, would you like to unmute? Yeah.
No, I don't think I have anything general to say. any specific thing to say. I was, in and out of paying attention. I'm very sorry about that. I would like to mention one thing about the whole series, though. It seems to me that one of the great advantages of what we've done so far is to pay attention to book 6, which has not been taken care of nearly as much as the end of book 5, and then, of course, the more metaphysical parts of 6 and 7. So I think that just focusing on book 6 and making book 6 a kind of general central object of this continuing series, I think is a major accomplishment. I think it's an innovation. So I will stop here. If something else comes up, I will come later. But I would thank Gail for the paper, and I'll think much more about semantic, ontological, confirmative, paradigmatic, and truth in the soul. I always get confused about distinctions, so I need to think about that. Thank you very much.
Okay, so now let us proceed to question. Please, yes, raise your digital hand if you want to raise a question. The first one is from Jessica Moss.
Moss.
Hi, everybody. Hi, Gail. You're not in Athens, are you?
No, unfortunately.
Okay, so thank you for this. It's really interesting. And I'm definitely persuaded that there's more semantic truth going on than I paid attention to, and that's really cool. I have some doubts that, sorry, I still think that in your passage 484, it makes sense to me to read it as ontological truth. I should say, by the way, I think Seif's, this is just a by the by, I think Seif's notion of ontological truth is maybe a bit too narrow. I think by true, Plato, in the ontological sense, means being, which could mean real, which could mean something like fundamentally real, whatever. But that was a by the by. I think that there's ontological truth comparatives and even superlatives implied in the divided line, which is going to come a bit later. So we get at, I noted it down, it's 511E is when we get the distinction that...
Alêtheia to Kaime.
No, I had the idea. So it's hosper ephois estin alêtheias meteche, to the extent that the things over which they're set participate in truth. Hutotatas apheneas. So the mental states are increasingly clear as you go up the line, and the objects of the mental states are increasingly share in truth. And it seems like another way you could put that is the things at the top are the truest things. So I would want to read that as another, making it not a one-off to say truest.
Okay, right. So I would say it's still a one-off in the sense that Plato doesn't actually, I think, ever use truest as a sort of narrow semantic point in a way for forms. One exception that some people mention is Phaedo 65E1-2, but I don't think it's used that way there. I mean, that's in a forthcoming paper. In some ways, it might not be surprising if he were to do it, to use the superlative for forms. And I agree that he sometimes, though not in all the passages that some people think, in my view, uses true for forms, like in the Phaedrus passage. But I was saying, if we just look at his actual use of alethic terms, he doesn't, in my view, ever use the superlative of the form of the good or of forms in general. And also, there is the question, I mean, I'm working on this, but I haven't worked it all out. But most people assume that there are two uses of alêtheia in the divided line passage. And most people assume that must be ontological. However, I'm not convinced of that.
I know. Yes, good. But I was just saying, if you had the view that the things they're set over are objects and that the things at the bottom are the least, it looks like at least we're getting a precedent for the idea of rankings and degrees of truth.
Right.
Do I have time? Oh, sorry. Maybe stick me at the end of the queue again, actually. Thanassis. Yeah. So thank you very much.
Okay, so let us proceed to Dukas Kapandais.
Yeah.
Sorry, Dukas.
Okay. Thank you very much for this inspiring analysis. I would have two questions. So I will put the first one too, and then depending on the time left and if Thanassis is generous enough, I will put the other one. So the first one is about the very idea of the false paradigm of X, the idea of a false paradigm of something, be it the philosopher or anything. So I would like to have some feedback on how you apprehend or Plato apprehend the very possibility of this to happen. I have the impression that the formal X in the Descartian sense, as you call it, has throughout needs to have throughout a causal relation to the X in the soul. So how is it possible that it comes to be as degenerate as to produce or to contribute to the production of a false paradigm in the ontological sense in the soul?
Right. Okay. So I don't know of a place where Plato actually mentions a false paradigm using some form of pseudos, but in describing the bad person, he says that person has a paradigm in his soul. I mean, that's he explicitly says he has, and that's either it might be he talks about having a bad ethos, a bad character or disposition. So his bad paradigm, his inadequate paradigm, might be his state of soul, or it might be the idea he forms of justice or injustice as a result of his having a certain character. So a paradigm is a bad or inadequate paradigm in the sense that, so the person with the bad soul who has a paradigm of injustice in his soul, it's bad in the sense that it doesn't really represent the true nature of injustice. And insofar as he has any account of justice, it's going to be a totally inadequate account. So a paradigm can be something that falls short, as Plato uses paradigms. They aren't all sort of perfect or anything. Similarly, later on, I think at 529, he talks about Daedalus, and he says Daedalus, might create a paradigm which would be very useful for a particular purpose, like maybe for making certain statues, but completely inadequate for other purposes. So in a way, a paradigm is a relational notion. You use it for a given purpose, and what you use it for, the paradigm might be adequate or inadequate for that purpose. So what's distinctive about the philosopher guardian is that her paradigm is completely adequate for her purposes. It's a clear paradigm embodying knowledge of what justice is, about what injustice is. It allows her to determine whether, by referring to it, to determine whether this person or that person, this action or that action is or isn't just. But an inferior person might have some idea of justice or injustice that's totally inadequate for answering those questions. It might be a genuine paradigm in that it's used the way paradigms are, but it's not a good one.
So forget about the appellation false. If someone has a bad paradigm of X, is X only homonymously called X, or has it any genuine bondage with the formal X? And if so, in which extent?
Right. So Plato allows that you can have an adequate or an inadequate paradigm of X, even if X doesn't exist. So he's trying to construct a paradigm of the ideally just polis, but there is no such thing in existence. But a paradigm, he creates it in words, but it's not of something that exists. So using something as a paradigm doesn't mean that the thing it's a paradigm of exists. Similarly, he talks about having a paradigm of a perfectly just person, but he says no person could be perfectly just, though some people can participate in justice to different degrees. So again, the thing that the paradigm is of doesn't exist except as the intentional object of the account. Does that answer your question?
Well, may I have a second follow-up, Thanassis? Well, the example is as follows. Suppose that I'm not intelligent or corrupt person, and I have within my soul a bad paradigm of a philosopher, of what a philosopher is. Is the philosopher in my soul, has the thing I have in my soul anything to do with the formal philosopher, with the idea of the philosopher, or with the philosopher as it ought to be? Or is it just an ambiguity? Two things that have nothing to do with one another?
If you have a bad paradigm in your soul of what it is to be a philosopher,
yes,
you have an account, but it's an inadequate account. It includes, say, some false beliefs or you ascribes to, and there may or may not be a real philosopher who exists. If there is, you haven't captured what it is, that person. So just to say something is a good or a bad paradigm doesn't by itself commit you to any views about whether the thing it's a paradigm of is or even could exist. In some cases it does, some cases it doesn't.
Okay, thank you. Thanks.
Okay. Let us proceed to Sengun. Angela, I apologize for mispronouncing your name.
Hi, I go by Angela.
Okay.
But thanks so much for this talk. I think I'm going to cheat a little bit and ask you a question about the end of Book 5, just because I think it might shed light about the way that truth is kind of being used in the beginning of Book 6. So I guess I was wondering what you thought of the way in which the whole Book 5 discussion starts, right? So Glaucon raises, oh, what about these weird lovers of sights and sounds? It seems like they're going to be philosophers on your view. Socrates is like, no, but they're like philosophers. Who are the true philosophers then? And then Socrates says they're lovers of the sight of truth. And that, which is alêtheia there. And then Glaucon's like, what do you mean by that? And then we have our entire kind of like canonical end of Book 5 discussion. And so it seems that, at least given the framing, we would expect the end of this the end of Book 5 discussion to kind of shed light on what it means to be a lover of truth. And even though he doesn't, or lover of the sight of truth at any rate, and even though Socrates doesn't kind of mention the word truth in the Book 5 discussion, I think there's kind of a natural way, right? Lovers of sights and sounds see and love the pretty colors, the many colors and the sounds, etc., but they don't see like the forms. Whereas the philosophers, I think even on your view, right, see and love the forms. And so we might naturally take that to be some sort of spelling out of what it means to be a lover of the sight of truth. And once we have that kind of like in our minds, when we enter Book 6 and this stuff about the paradigm and what is truest, I was wondering whether you thought, like, why not think, regardless of what the paradigm is, why not think what is truest kind of refers to the forms there? Okay. So I guess I was just wondering about that. Thank you.
Right. The passage you mentioned, lovers of the sight of truth is often taken to be referring to forms there. That's, Jessica says that in her book. Halliwell says that in his commentary. Halliwell's only reason for thinking that must be forms is that he says, well, semantic truth, that's not special enough. But it could be that philosophers are those who love sight, that is knowledge of, Plato sometimes uses alêtheia for semantic truth quite generally, but sometimes he uses it in a restricted way for truths that tell you what forms are, the special truths that are truths that are the content of wisdom. And so I'm tempted to take the Republic 5 remark, the one that Angela just mentioned, that's before we get into the argument that doesn't use alethic terms, that he means philosophers are those who love knowledge of the truth, where that's semantic truth, but the truths are restricted to truths about forms. And he gradually spells that out. So we saw passages in Book 6 where he talks about philosophers loving truth. I think they do love forms too. It's not like they love semantic truth and don't love forms. They love both. But he wants to emphasize that philosophers especially love knowledge of or a knowledgeable account or encounter with forms. And so he uses alêtheia sometimes for those special truths. So I would be tempted to take that remark at the beginning of Republic 5 as having to do with semantic truth. Of course, that fits well with my now very old, as Alexander pointed out, paper on Republic 5, that it involves a veridical notion of ani. And then in Book 6, he often uses alethic terms, distinguishing them from ontic terms, and uses them, in my view, though not in everybody's view, for semantic truth.
Sorry, I guess if I could just specify a little bit. So the Halliwell kind of comment is interesting, right? Like, oh, it's not special enough. But I guess my question was coming at it from the perspective of the context, right? So we have this weird claim, philosophers are lovers of the sight of truth. And then we get this talk about loving and seeing. And what is it that philosophers love and see? I thought even on your view, the thing that they love and see are the forms. So just given the kind of way that the argument plays out, I was wondering, not like, oh, what do we do with this weird notion of alêtheia here? But we're asking a question, what does it mean to be the lover of the sight of truth? We're given some sort of very long description of philosophers seeing and loving the forms. And so why isn't that some reason to think that we do have this ontic notion?
I think Plato sometimes speaks about loving forms, and I think he often uses ontic terms. And so part of my project is just how is alêtheia and how are other alethic terms used in various passages. I do not deny that Plato thinks we love forms, or that philosophers love forms. I think he sometimes says that. I think he sometimes uses forms of ani, onta, ousia, for forms, and talks about them loving that. But I think he also talks about them loving particular truths that tell us what forms are. I think he speaks in both ways. And I think it makes sense to think, given other passages, that if we're just asking the narrow question of how alêtheia is used in that passage, I think we can make sense of it on the assumption that it there in that one passage refers to semantic truth. There are a lot of passages where Plato talks about liking, like ta'on kai alêtheia. And many people think, oh, alêtheia is just referring back to ta'on, but then sometimes he goes on to separate them and offer different interpretations, as in the sun simile. And so insofar as my focus is how truth terminology is used, I don't think we have to take that passage to be using alêtheia to mean forms. I don't mean to deny that Plato thinks philosophers love forms, and I think he makes that claim in various places, either directly or by using some form of ani. But it may be some places truth, but I don't think in that particular passage, it's obvious that we have to say that. I think we can make sense of the Republic 5 argument and what he goes on to say in 6 without assuming that. That's not a knockdown argument, but I think it is a plausible view.
Thank you so much.
Okay, next one is Leslie Brown.
Question follows on quite nicely from Angela's and from your answer to Angela's, because you suggested in your answer to Angela's that the sight of truth is the sight of special truths, and presumably what makes them special is that they're truths about reality. Anyway, my question was going to be about 485c7. Nothing is more, I forget how you translated oikeoteron, more congenial.
Nothing belongs to it.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Congenial. Nothing
I just
is
use that word. More, is it oikeoteron?
Yes, yes. Well, let's leave it in Greek.
To wisdom more than truth.
Yes, nothing is more oikeos to wisdom than truth.
Yeah.
And again, you wanted truth there to be semantic truth. But I think in explaining that, you said, well, that's because wisdom is truth entailing, and it's about the most important truths. So semantic truth kind of shades into, or if it doesn't shade into ontological truth, there are kind of elements of ontological truth, i.e. reality, there too, if you want to explain the notion that nothing is more oikeon to wisdom than truth in terms not just of semantic truths, but of these very special semantic truths, which I take it are special because they're truths about reality. So I guess both that passage that Angela mentioned and this one, your answer focuses on semantic truth, but kind of concedes quite a bit to the idea of truth as reality.
I don't think it concedes anything to using alethic terms for reality. It's one thing to say that nothing belongs to wisdom more than forms, and another thing to say that nothing belongs to it more than truths about forms. So I think Plato uses, so that would be a purely semantic understanding of the word alêtheia, but Plato uses alêtheia and other forms of other alethic terms in both a broad and a narrow way. That doesn't mean that when they're used narrowly, it shades into or is a kind of ontological truth, but it's a truth, a semantic truth about certain things. But I think it's important to distinguish alêtheia being used for forms and being used for truths about them. And so I wanted truth in that passage to be truths, a narrow range. So similarly, like in the Philebus, Plato sometimes uses nous and phronesis very broadly for maybe any truth entailing cognitive condition. And then at 59, he narrows it to the highest cognitive condition. So it's not a change in sense. It's not but he's just narrowing the use of the term. So similarly, narrowing alêtheia from all semantic truths to a particular range. It's still purely semantic, but it's just this range that's relevant in certain contexts. That doesn't seem to me to be conceding anything about the use of the alethic term.
I just feel that Plato might not see such an important distinction there as you want to say there is. And I think you also want to say that he sees the distinction as an important one.
Well, I at least want to say there's no reason to think he's sliding it, that you can provide what to me seems like a plausible account on which they are kept separate in various contexts. Whether it's to what degree it's conscious, to what degree he's thought it through, I don't know. But if to the extent that one can provide an account on which he systematically, in fact, distinguishes them this way, that's a reason to think it was at some level conscious. But it's certainly not, I don't think it's a good reason to think he's confused. Like Hester says, oh, he's always slipping into ontological from semantic. I don't think we need to assume anything like that.
Thanks.
Okay, and next is Kungo Ro, if I spell it correctly. Yeah.
It is correct. It is correct. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. And thank you.
Almost truth.
Okay. Thank you for the excellent talk and detailed analysis. And my question is to make sure whether my understanding is correct or not about the semantic truths as the paradigms in the soul. Can we say that in the Crito, in the dialogue Crito, there are 5 principles about justice and injustice. For instance, one should not do harm to anyone or any police, or even when one is wronged, one should not harm anyone. One should, for example, these 5 senses are 5 principles about justice, and then can I say that are they are the paradigms in the souls of guardians as the semantic truths about justice? This is my question. And one interesting passage in the Crito is that these passages are described as the truth say. says to us. So that's my question. Thank you.
Right, I would have to look at the Crito passage again, but if these are purporting to state the truth about justice, then that's an example of semantic truth.
Mhm.
The truth is that such and such. So those would be general principles which can, be described, and so they're logoi of some sort. Whether they're in the soul of this or that person. I mean, I think logos Plato sometimes uses as, sort of an abstract notion, an account that's maybe a proposition, as propositions are sometimes viewed, though I'm not sure about that. And sometimes he seems to me to use a logos as something more like a sentence token. So like if I give birth to a logos, that's not an abstract proposition. It's my particular logos at a given time. And I think when he's talking about the paradigm in the soul, I mean, he doesn't tell us what it is, but on the account he doesn't spell out the content of it, but on the account I was suggesting, it would be like a definition and a rational account giving an aiteias logismos in the Minos terms of what justice is, if the paradigm is of the form of justice. So it would be saying what the thing is, where that's, a linguistic kind of thing rather than justice itself, the form or the universal or the property. And I was arguing that it's the linguistic kind of thing, which is in the soul as the content of one's knowledge. So it's like epistemic mental content in that particular case.
Okay, thank you.
Does that answer your question?
Thank you.
Sometimes people talk about propositional truth rather than semantic. I was avoiding that because there's so much dispute about what propositions are. People dispute about whether Plato has them even. Some people like David Wohlstorff speak about representational truth because it's an account representing some state of affairs, distinct from the state of affairs. That would work for me too.
Okay, so
Right.
next is Alexander and Nehamas.
Yes, thank you, Gail, very much. I don't really want to talk about the various truths at this point. I'd just like to, again, I guess, support a view that I've expressed. I don't think we should just assume that the objects that are discussed at the end of Book 5 are forms. When I gave my paper earlier, I suggested that you need both separation and intelligibility, and Gail pointed out that there's very little, if any, discussion of separation in what happens following. But there is discussion of intelligibility, and the forms play a very distinct role in coming later in the argument to explain why it is that the philosophers have the right kind of character to be leaders. So I think that a lot of what we're saying about truth of any kind does not necessarily apply, so to speak, explicitly and theoretically to the forms. It opens the ground to explain what that kind of truth is once we have established that forms are actually in the picture, which comes at around 500. No need to reply, Gail. I just wanted to state that whether we have forms or not in book 5 and for part of book 6 is, to me anyway, a disputed issue. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, and next one is Claudia Yo.
Yeah.
Did you want to?
Sorry, yeah.
Hi, Claudia. I should say to everyone that I've learned a lot from Claudia's work on paradigms.
That is so funny. Thank you so much.
And wisdom. Sophia. She's great on Sophia too.
She is.
Affirmed. I had a question about the comparison with painters in section 2. So I was wondering if you could just say more about how exactly in that context. I was thinking when painters look to what is it's not a semantic kind of truth, I think.
Which is not?
when painters look to what is truest. So the comparison is philosophers are looking to what is truest. I was thinking the way painters look to what is truest, but they don't mean, the forms. He means something like, the real person there that they're trying to copy onto the page, onto the cave painting or whatever. And so I was thinking, yeah, the way painters look to what is truest, whatever truest means there, it's not a semantic kind of truest. And so then there's pressure to make it a different kind for the philosopher too. But I mean, I see other ways of reading it. So I was wondering if you could just say more about how you're reading the comparison.
Right. Okay, so I mean, as you know probably better than me, Plato uses both the painter analogy and paradigms in many different ways. So sometimes the painter, well, like the Guardian, has a paradigm and uses it in painting the city. So the paradigm isn't, and sometimes the painter might have like a mental idea, a mental representation, and then he tries to paint it. So those are two very different ways in which the painter metaphor is used. And there is an interesting passage in book 10 where he says, talking about painters, it's kind of a metaphor and tries to lay out a more literal account of what's meant. So the painter metaphor can be understood in different ways and is by Plato in different times. And I think and even if, well, so in this passage, I would say the painter A looks to what's truest. And I take that to be the paradigm and refers to it in doing various things. So what is he doing? Well, he's painting the city. I mean, the laws and stuff that he wants to inculcate are the nomima about the fine and just good things. He wants to lay those down. That's what he's painting. He talks elsewhere about molding their characters and so on. So that's the painting. And so he's considering here a case where they've got a paradigm and then paint on the basis of the paradigm. And the paradigm, well, for a painter, it might be a real thing, but since different kinds of things are counted as paradigms, we'd have to say, how do we transfer over the abstract claim that you've got a paradigm of some sort or other and use it to paint something or other? And so in this case, I'd say the philosopher has a paradigm, which is an account, which would be like the painter having some kind of mental image, and refers to that account in painting the city the way that he wants it to be, or sometimes he uses the model of a sculptor rather than a painter. That's how I would take it. Does that seem implausible to you?
That's really helpful. I think it's kind of like whatever truest, whatever, if it's, I guess I feel like if truest is semantic for the philosopher, what the meaning of truest, there is a semantic truth in the philosopher case. I want the meaning of truest to be semantic truth also in the painter case. So when we talk about the painter looking to what is truest, we also want something like semantic truth in that case, just because of how tightly that comparison is made. But I think what you're saying is it can still mean semantic truth in the philosopher case, but in the painter case, it's more like kind of the like legitimacy of the concept that the painter has in mind or something like that.
That's right. I would say something like that.
Gotcha. Yeah, and that's really
sorry. You're saying it's fun. Does that seem implausible to you?
It doesn't seem. So I like that better than the painter just going full on for ontological truth meaning there.
Yeah.
Because then I feel really strong pressure to say
Yeah.
It's ontological truth in philosopher case too. But yeah, I guess I still have the sense that it should really mean the same thing, the same sense of true in the two cases. So if it's conceptual accuracy or something in the painter case, it should also be the same in the philosopher.
Plato does, I think, describe cases like that where the painter already has some idea of what he wants to create, and that would be the paradigm. It doesn't have to be a sort of actual thing in the world. So it'd be like well, it might be a mental representation, would be a slightly broader. I think that's one reason Woolstorff likes to speak about representational truth. It might be some kind of mental representation rather than a spelled out account of something. I mean, they're not going to be exactly the same because the painter doesn't, it's nothing to do with forms.
That's really helpful.
Yeah,
Thank
I'm
you.
not sure why he uses and I think the reason he uses truest is that the particular paradigm, if it's a logos, as I wanted to say, it's not about all STs, but the truths that tell you what a form is, which I think is also how he uses truest in Vito. I think it's 65 E1 to 2, which some people think is forms, but I think is not.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so Jessica, please follow.
Thanks. Yeah, or I could go after the others since I've already had a turn. Yeah.
No, please go on.
Okay, thanks. I have a bunch of things. Okay, just on this passage 484. Sorry. First, I thought, you know what? Logos is good, and having a logos in your soul is surely the way of having the form in your soul, and I'm happy with it. But
No,
now,
it's not. No, it's not a way of having the form in the soul.
sorry, I didn't mean that. I meant you can't literally have a form in your soul, so surely it's the way of having a form as a paradigm is to have it. But I'm now wondering what you want to do with towards the end of that passage, we get this contrast between what's there and what's down here. So we have kakese and ta and thade, and that works so tidily on the assumption that the paradigms are the forms, those are up there, those are over there, and then we're going to use them to the idea of looking back and forth. I don't know. I guess it seems to me like I know how to read all these metaphors on the assumption that we're looking back and forth between one kind of thing and another kind of thing, and
yeah, I mean, Adam agrees with you, and he actually translates kakesa as yonder.
yeah.
And he has a note saying, it's because it's the forms are there, and enthada is everything here. But I think kakesa is just anaphoric and refers back to the paradigm in the soul, and enthada are the nomima he wants to establish in the city.
But what would be okay, so it's not as strong a contrast, right? It's not over there and
exactly
here. Okay. The other thing that I wanted to say, so I was really glad Angela brought up the 475E passage about the site of truth, because I thought that was also a plausible precedent for this. And I mean, I'm not sure, I guess I'm not sure how much I'm disagreeing with you and I think it depends on whether you're saying Plato almost never talks about ontological truth,
No,
or saying
I
we
didn't
can
say
just
that.
read it. Right. Okay, good. Yeah, good. So I think with all these passages, we can find parallels. And I was thinking with the site of truth stuff, there's a very similar passage in the Phaedrus when we're talking about the disembodied souls. It's 248C. They can see it's katidane, one of the alêtheia things. So you could say
and
that's
I cited the Phaedrus at the beginning as a place where alêtheia is used for forms.
right, but just because it's seeing it there. The other place that's much closer to home is in the Republic around 508D when we have the sun analogy, and there the forms, well, the soul when it's turned towards the things on which truth and being shine.
Yeah.
That's analogous to the eyes looking at looking at things that are illuminated by the sun. So you might want to read that with 475E and think, oh, okay, we have
yeah.
these.
Well, but alêtheia, I mean, I have a story to tell about the sun, but
yeah, okay, I figured you would, yeah.
But I mean, he does mention alêtheia to kaion together at the beginning. Then he goes on to explain each of them separately, linking alêtheia with episteme and and ousia with the essence of forms. So I don't think he's using them interchangeably. And also, if truth is analogous to light, well, the forms aren't light.
Yeah.
Light isn't a property of them. It's so
no, but truth shines on them, right? You might think they're illuminated or something like that. But
yeah, that means they become known.
Yeah, good. Okay, I got one more and then I'll stop. Wonder what you think about the famous strange passage. So this was going to be for truth as a cognitive state, the thing that Seif talks about. The passage in the beginning of the Timaeus, the famous Akos stuff, where as being is to becoming, so alêtheia is to pistis.
Yeah, Seif cites that.
Yeah, what do you think? I mean, it's such a strange passage in various ways, but one natural thought is, oh, pistis there is something like doxa, and so alêtheia must be something like episteme.
Yeah, I haven't thought about that passage in detail. I don't have a worked out account. And again, I don't know that I'd want to say Plato never does that, but in the various passages that Xanthippe cites from the Republic anyway, and there's some others I didn't discuss, I don't think he does.
Okay.
But we have to go through, we'd have to go through all of them. And I always think you got to take like one passage at a time and,
definitely.
discuss it in detail and then see if it fits with other things or not.
Good. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, so the next one is Octavian Purik.
Okay, thank you very much for the intriguing presentation. So my question is related to paradigms and this idea of paradigms as accounts. So as you said, as accounts of the form, as you said, paradigms have an epistemic function, right? So, and ideally paradigms, I would assume, are informed by form, right?
Paradigms are what?
Are informed by forms. So philosophers have their paradigms or accounts, right, of what justice is or what beauty is by looking at the forms, while ignorant people have their paradigms informed by, I don't know, something else. So keeping that in mind, paradigms are used by philosophers to produce things also, to produce laws, right, to produce constitutions and so on and so forth. And my question is, forms have this metaphysical function of making particulars have a property, right? So a particular instance of equality has the property equality because it participates in the form, for example. Since philosophers also employ paradigms to produce particular instances of justice, beauty, or even equal things, I don't know. It seems, my question is, what are they looking at? Are they looking at the form when they produce these images or these instantiations, or are they looking at an account of the form? What is the object which they rely on when they produce instances or images of the form?
Well, I think Plato speaks both ways. So in the 500 passage, he seems to me, though not to Berniat, to be speaking about, to say that we look to forms, the philosopher does. But in other passages, like on my reading of 484c, the philosopher looks to the paradigm in his soul. So I think Plato speaks both ways. Why does he speak both ways? That seems weird. And they seem to have the same function. They're something that you look at in trying to bring about a particular course of action or make people be a certain way or law. Why would he speak both ways? My answer to that was, they aren't really two separate activities in the sense that, what is it to look at a form? Well, obviously you don't look at it with your eyes. So it's some kind of mental thing. But what kind of mental thing? Well, you access forms by having an account of them. That's what it is to know a form. To know a form consists in, on my view, having an account of what it is. So you could speak either way, because to know a form is to have an account that constitutes knowledge that tells you what the form really is. And that's the way you access forms. So there used to be this old debate between Bloch and Cross in the 70s, maybe when I was a graduate student. Bloch saying, oh, you know forms, that's direct acquaintance, non-propositional, non-linguistic. And Cross saying, no, forms are just logoi. I don't think either of those was right. Forms exist, as you said, they're properties, or give things properties. People differ about which way to put that. They're not propositions, but it's not as though there's some way of accessing them that gives you knowledge other than having an account. That's what knowledge of a form consists in. And I think one reason, I think that's why Plato feels he can speak either way. Once you understand that to know a form is to know an account, and to have a paradigm is to be able to try to put that, into practice in the world.
Okay, would you like Octavian to make a follow-up, or are you okay?
Yes. So just to do you take into account, for example, the Timaeus and how the demiurge uses the forms in order to give or to create images in the Torah? If you find any, let's say, difficulties there, because my first thought would be that what you say is that an account is just a form in the soul.
Aristotle talks about forms in the soul. Plato doesn't use that way. He talks about a paradigm in the soul, a logos in the soul. He doesn't actually, as far as I know, talk about a form in the soul in these kinds of contexts.
Okay. This is what I picked up from what you said, that knowing the form simply means having an account of the form. Is that true?
To know what a form is to know an account of what it is. Yeah, that's what I said.
Okay.
But the form is still a real entity that exists entirely independently of me.
Okay. And you would say that there is no other access to the form as part of, as far as intellectual contact is, besides having an account, right?
No, I don't think that, because like in the 490 passage, I mean, I think Plato thinks you can have access to forms through different truths about them. So somebody might have true beliefs about forms, and he distinguishes sometimes levels of knowledge. So you could have a higher or lower type of knowledge. So there are different ways of accessing forms, but they're all through the beliefs you have about it or the lower level type of knowledge that you have of it.
Socrates has true beliefs about the form of the good, right?
I think so. Not everybody would accept that.
Yeah, but they're wrong.
Me neither, but this is another matter of discussion. Okay, so Xanthippe Bourlogianni is next.
Thank you very much for your inspiring talk. My question concerns again metaphysics and all this discussion about the form in the soul. I'm not sure exactly what you meant, but your account, also your reference, your mention of Descartes and ontological immanence suggested that somehow not that the logos is the form in the soul, is more like the form is instantiated in the soul as logos, because somehow logos is the material of the soul, and it's a way of the form to be instantiated. This is, I mean, I thought that it's one way to take what you say. And if this were so, it would be somehow the logos or the truth would be an expression of the form, not exactly identical to the form, strictly speaking, an expression or copy of the form, which at the same time would be ontologically inferior to the form. So somehow, in this way, we could say that the semantic truth would be also ontologically inferior, somehow realization of the form. I don't know, what would you say about this?
I guess I don't think that, I wouldn't want to say that the logos is a copy of the form or an instantiation of the form. So the logos of justice doesn't participate, for example, in the form of justice. To participate in the form of justice would to involve being just to some degree or to approximate to being just. So the things that participate in forms in general, at least if it's a thing like justice, aren't logoi, but particular people, particular actions or types of actions, those participate in forms. But I don't think Plato would want to say that the logos of justice, an account of the nature of justice, spelling out its essence. I don't think he wants to say that it participates in the form. And so it doesn't exemplify the form by being itself a just thing. It's in a different kind of category. Justice and injustice don't apply to the logos. Plato does sometimes talk about just or fine logoi, but by there he just means that, you know, somebody can be very well spoken, or an account can be a very good account or something. But I don't know of a place in these kinds of contexts where he would talk about a logos as being a copy of a form and inferior to the form. That's not the way he speaks in these passages. There may be other passages where one could get that out of Plato, but the paradigm in the soul isn't said to be a copy of the form. I don't know if that helps or clarifies anything I said.
Okay, thank you. So you don't.
I was thinking the logos in the soul is like a sentence token, a sort of semantic entity, the content of the mental state is part of the mental state. And that's just different from the form that it's about.
Yeah, for sure. I just thought that I didn't mean that the logos participates in the form. It's more like the soul or the person participates in the form, and this is how this participation is expressed. But understand that is not what you wanted to say by immanence.
It may be that the philosopher who has the paradigm in his soul is just, because to be the philosopher, you have to have acquired all the virtues and so on. But that's a different view from saying that in general, the basic notion of having a paradigm in the soul, suppose it's a paradigm of F, doesn't require the soul that has it to be F. So the philosopher might also have a paradigm in his soul of the nature of what it is to be double or equal. That doesn't mean that he himself is double or equal.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, next one is Raluca Bujor.
Hello, thank you very much, Professor Fine, for this very beautiful talk. Since it's a bit late, I had many questions, but I will try to narrow it down. And I think maybe I will just continue on the last question. Since you said that having a paradigm in the soul doesn't mean that you become that which the paradigm is about, then how do you, I guess my question was about the relationship between text 2 and text 3, because in the third, in text 3, we have this impression that somebody is not unjust because they don't have the paradigm of injustice in their soul, because of the fact that they didn't grow up I don't know, with many bad examples around. So it seems as if paradigm in that sense in text 3 is very, it does imply that you become what your paradigm is about. It can, if we only talk about justice, if we talk about beauty or about mathematical entities, then maybe it's different. But if we talk about justice, and I think in text 2, which is, if I understood correctly, your main text, your main reference, it's also, the topic is also justice, because they are talking about who will guard the laws and who will, whether we want a blind person who would be wandering around the particulars or somebody who has this paradigm. And if it's a logos, then how do we, what kind of logos is it? If we say it's an account, does it have a performative aspect? Is it something that is transferable? Can I transfer this sort of logos? Can I teach somebody my paradigm? Or is it more like let's say like a Stoic, like the Stoics were practicing those dogmas, they were repeating them all the time in a sort of performative function? I'm not sure it's clear, but what sort of logos is it, if it's a logos, this paradigm? Is it like a normal definition?
Yeah, it's an answer to the Platonic TSD question. So according to Plato anyway, I can't just tell it to you and you thereby know it yourself, because that's why he's going through all the stuff about education. You have to get your soul into the right condition to be able to understand certain things. So it's the kind of thing that someone else could also come to have the same paradigm in their soul if they went through the right kind of education. So it's not transferable in the sense that I can't just say it out loud and then you get it. According to Plato, you have to have gone through this education. And then he sketches the education. So the philosopher, if he's got the paradigm in his soul, which is a logos, he's gone through that educational process and his soul has been prepared such that he can work it out and understand what it is to be just, what the nature of justice is, what the form of justice is. In his soul, it's like a sentence token, the particular content in his mind, and he can maybe express it. And he gave birth to it after the encounter with forms, which would be having mere true beliefs or lower level knowledge of forms. Then he gradually gets the paradigm, which is a full account of a form, by going through this educational process, the psychic pregnancy and birth.
But if I can just add something very, very quick.
Yes.
If it is related to this paideia, then again, maybe it's not a simple account. Maybe we need to make a distinction between something that I could learn from by reading a book or by speaking with Socrates, let's say, and something that I need to learn by following such all the paideia.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you if you want to say that the paradigm isn't just going to be a one sentence thing saying justice is ABC. Some people think it's like a whole theory of justice and includes all the, all the virtues and how they're related and many things. So yes, it might be a terribly complex, difficult thing. But my question was just, is it the form itself that's the paradigm in the soul? Or is it a Platonic answer to the TSD question, a linguistic, semantic kind of thing? And I didn't say anything about what the precise content of that would be or how complicated it would be, except that it would be something that you can't get easily and can't just say to someone such that they understand it. And that's the product, the end result of the education that he sketches. So my question was just really not the details of what is this paradigm going to be like, what is its content, but is it something like an answer to a TSD question? Or is it the form that the TSD question is about?
Okay, thank you very, very much.
Okay, it's exactly 8 o'clock. If you don't mind, I would like to reserve the last question for myself and a brief one. Okay, I would like to bring again back the question about the degrees of truth and the analogy with the sun. In book 6, in 508d10, where Plato says that the form of the good provides truth, την αληθείαν παρέχει, both της γιγνωσκομένης, the objects of knowledge, and το γιγνώσκοντι, the subject of γιγνώσκοντι. And I can imagine that if provides truth to το γιγνώσκοντι, that is compatible with the semantic meaning of truth that you mentioned. But in the case of της γιγνωσκομένης, that seems to me that refers directly to forms and not to the accounts of the forms. And this may be supported later, a few lines later in 509b5, where the form of the good provides not only truth, but it provides της γιγνωσκομένης again, the being, το είναι, and ουσίανς, esse. This sounds to me heavily ontological.
Yeah, but the passage you just read out, he's switching to the ontic terms, and I take him to be distinguishing the alethic and the ontic terms. So yes, there's ontological stuff there, and the form of the good contributes to the being of forms, and that's a purely ontological claim. But I think he separates, I don't think he takes being and truth to be the same. They're different properties, both provided in some way, but in different ways by the form of the good.
Yes, I agree. But if we agree that the being toine and ousian refer directly to the forms instead of each of their accounts, um, he also says that it provides truth as well to this gignos comenis back in 508 D10. So it seems that the form of the good provides three things: ine, einai, ousian, and alêtheia.
But that if you are agreeing that those are different, that's fine.
Yeah,
That
okay.
means that truth isn't identical to being here. And then we have to figure out what is it instead. And he goes on to link it with episteme and gnosis. So I would say it's the semantic truth that you have when you have knowledge that this, because you can't know the truth about the form of the good unless, you can't know the truth about whether things are good and so on unless you know the form of the good. So it's relevant to that issue, but that would be the semantic truth. But the form of the good also provides ousia because it's part of the essence of all good things. So those are just two different claims. I agree they're both there. It's not a purely epistemological thing.
Yes.
My concern would just be to say that alêtheia and the ontic terms are used for different properties. Some of the form of the good is relevant to both, but in different ways.
Okay. And do we have to take, I mean, the sun analogy, where the sun provides light not only to the vision of someone, but also to objects themselves, right? And the light is similar, the analogous to truth in this context. So it works like, is this the ontological epistemic notion that V-VII talks about in this case?
Well, I didn't read my section on that, and I'm still working on it. But I would say that the form of the good unless we grasp the form of the good, we can't know these other things. It provides truth to them in the sense that we have to know how they're related to the form of the good to know what they are. But the alêtheia itself is, I would say, semantic truth. But then there are also, as you say, these ontic terms, which are making an ontological metaphysical point. So there's both an epistemological and an ontological point. And alêtheia conveys the epistemological point and a semantic truth. And the ontic terms are used not veridically, but for the essence and nature of things, that are how they're related to the form of the good.
Yeah, okay. Okay, so thank you very much for your talk, for being there, and for all these interesting things and the interesting discussion. Thank you all for being here very much. And I hope we will see you the next week, next Wednesday, with Rachel Barney talk.
Thank you very much, everybody, for your
Thank you very much.
coming.
Thank you. Okay, have a nice night.
Bye-bye.